Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Russell Barkley. I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin this course, I'd like to share with you my sources of support for the previous year so that you have an opportunity to evaluate whether any potential conflict of interest exists in this presentation. Besides being retired from the University of Massachusetts Medical School, which I did in 2002, I've remained active in giving a number of lectures internationally on the subject of ADHD and related disorders. I also receive various product royalties from different publishing companies as well as seminar and continuing education companies. And of course, you'll want to know that I do work for and consult with many of the pharmaceutical companies that have products in the ADHD marketplace. This particular course is going to focus on the nature of ADHD, its diagnosis, some of its demographic characteristics, and particularly its subtyping. Currently, we view ADHD as a developmental disorder in the development of two neuropsychological attributes or capacities. The first of these is a difficulty in hyperactive and impulsive behavior. This is a dimension that reflects problems with the development of motor and cognitive inhibition. This problem with inhibition is manifested in impaired verbal behavior, such as in excessive speech or in interrupting other individuals. It's also manifested in difficulties with motor inhibition, and this, of course, is seen in impulsive actions and gestures. But we also see problems with cognitive inhibition, in that the individual engages in impulsive decision-making without due regard for the future consequences of their actions. This also leads them to steeply discount the nature and value of the future consequences, and to have difficulties, therefore, with deferred gratification. That is to say that they have much more a focus or fascination with immediate gratification, even small rewards, over larger delayed consequences. Now, of course, this dimension of ADHD symptoms is also where we find the excessive motor movement of the individual, the hyperactivity that is, and this is manifested in excessive fidgeting, squirming, running about, climbing, and touching objects in childhood. But this problem with motor movement is going to decrease markedly with age, such that by adolescence, and particularly by adulthood, it is no longer of diagnostic value. It will be the difficulties with executive functioning and self-regulation that are much more prominent in the adult and even in the adolescent with ADHD than is likely to be the case in childhood. Now, we also see in ADHD a problem that is not emphasized in the current diagnostic and statistical manual, that is the DSM-IV criteria for ADHD, and that is a problem with emotional impulsiveness. But of course there has to be impulsive emotion here, because emotion is welded to everything that we think, that we say, and that we do. And so if people with ADHD are more impulsive in these other domains, then they almost by default have to be more impulsive in expressing their emotions. Now, this is not a mood disorder, and it's not an emotional disorder. ADHD individuals have rational moods and emotions. It's just that they're very impulsive in showing them, which is to say that their emotions are expressed in a more raw and unmoderated form, and done so more quickly than would be seen in normal individuals. The emotion itself is fine. It's just that it hasn't undergone the top-down regulation of the emotional state that would be more characteristic of an individual of normal development or of greater maturity. That is, the executive aspects of controlling emotion are where the problem resides, not in the emotion itself. Nevertheless, people with ADHD are going to express their emotions more quickly and in a less moderated form than other individuals. And this is going to be especially true for emotions such as impatience, low frustration tolerance, quickness to anger, and being easily prone to just emotional excitability or arousal. Now, we also know that people with ADHD are going to have difficulties with regulating emotions once they're expressed. This is the second stage of emotion, after the inhibition of emotion. Normal individuals downregulate and self-soothe their emotions and make them more socially acceptable and more consistent with their longer-term goals and welfare. This will be a stage of emotional control that people with ADHD also have difficulty with. So I emphasize this because it's not in the DSM-IV, although it should be. Impulsive emotion has been part of ADHD since its discovery in 1798 by Alexander Crichton, and it has been part of our theorizing of ADHD ever since. But beginning in 1968, the impulsive emotions of ADHD and the poor regulation of emotion was removed in the first diagnostic criteria for ADHD in DSM-II, and it has ever since then been left out of our diagnostic criteria for ADHD. It is certainly my hope that in DSM-V we will see a return of impulsive emotion as a central feature of ADHD back in the DSM diagnostic criteria. Now, the section of ADHD that is not developing on schedule is that of inattention. But inattention in and of itself is not of particular diagnostic value. Virtually all psychiatric disorders interfere with attention in one aspect or another, and that is because neuropsychology recognizes that there are at least 6 different kinds of attention mediated in the human brain. Each has a different network, a different location in the brain, and each is probably mediated to some extent by different neurotransmitters. And all of these aspects of attention are not impaired in ADHD. So what we want to know is there any particular one that ADHD interferes with over the others that might be of some diagnostic value? And the answer is yes. Over the previous 10 years or more, scientists have been able to show that ADHD poses a particular problem in persistence of behavior and actions toward goals or tasks. That is, ADHD involves a problem with future-directed sustained attention or sustained action. I think the term persistence is particularly appropriate here, and that is because we are referring here to the ability to sustain action toward a goal, and not in a perceptual aspect of attention, such as in arousal or alertness, or in sensory detection, or in selective aspects of attention, such as in focused attention. It is in the ability to sustain action toward a goal that we see the greatest problems with ADHD. One way of understanding this is if you think of the brain simplistically as an input-output device. ADHD does not especially involve interference with the input aspects of the brain, that is, with attention on the input side. Instead, ADHD interferes with the output of behavior, that is, how behavior is planned, organized, executed, sustained, evaluated, and otherwise monitored. Now, all of these are frontal lobe or motor brain aspects, and this is where ADHD is likely to have its greatest adverse effect, and that is on the output side of the brain. So it's best to think of the difficulties with sustained attention often attributed to ADHD as problems with poor persistence toward tasks, goals, and the future more generally. Now, related to this problem with persistence is a difficulty with resisting distractions. And it's important to understand here that the difficulty is not one, again, of perception. People with ADHD do not perceive distractors better than anyone else. It's not as if they have a lower threshold of perception. Instead, what we see is that they have great difficulties with resisting responding to the distracting events. And so they're going to react to an event that is irrelevant to the goal and find themselves off task much more quickly than other people are. Normal individuals are going to detect the distracting event but not react to it. They're going to suppress that response and continue their actions toward their goals and their plans. Now, all of us from time to time are going to be distracted or disrupted, usually by important events, and so we're going to have to stop engaging in the task that we were previously engaged in, and we're going to have to shift our attention and behavior over to dealing with the interruption. But normal individuals, once they have dealt with the distracting event, re-engage the incompleted goal. That is, they get back on task and re-engage the activities they were originally engaged in before being distracted. This is a particular problem for people with ADHD because once distracted, they are far less likely to return to the original task and complete it, and instead they will skip from one uncompleted activity to another, not completing any of the previous tasks, and simply following distracting events and the general flow of the now wherever it may take them. Now, this difficulty with re-engaging a task once disrupted is not a function of any of the attention networks. It appears to be a function of working memory. Now, working memory is one of the 7 major executive functions mediated by the prefrontal cortex. It can be thought of quite simply as holding information in mind that is guiding behavior over time toward a goal. And so it includes not only the goal and not just the sequence of actions toward the goal, but the timing of when these actions have to be executed as well. Now, all of this information is being held actively, consciously, in mind, and it is serving a purpose. It is guiding our actions over time. We can think of it simply as remembering so as to do things. It's not remembering facts or knowledge. It's not long-term storage or retrieval or the traditional sense in which we often think of memory. It is memory being put to work in the service of guiding behavior toward the future, and specifically toward a goal that the individual has chosen to pursue. So here we see evidence that ADHD interferes with one of the major executive functions, raising the possibility that ADHD may itself be an executive function disorder. Whether it is or not, certainly there is evidence to show that many of the symptoms that we attribute to the inattentive dimension of ADHD are actually difficulties with working memory. Now, since inhibition is also one of the 7 major executive functions, we see then that ADHD may be a disorder that interferes with at least 2 of the executive functions. The first symptom dimension that we mentioned was a problem with inhibition. And this symptom dimension that we're now discussing, that of inattention, may include problems with working memory. Now, I have another lecture on this website that goes into more detail about whether or not ADHD is a disorder of executive functioning. I certainly think it is, and I hope that you'll take that course in order to understand my reasoning for reaching that conclusion. But for now, let's just say that ADHD involves a problem with inhibition, and with those aspects of attention that involve persistence toward a goal, resisting distractions, and re-engaging tasks once we have been disrupted, or in working memory. Now, let's pursue a number of the demographic aspects of ADHD, and then we will return back to the subject of the nature of ADHD and its subtypes. ADHD originally was thought to occur in approximately 2 to 5% of children. Now, this is based on earlier DSM criteria, but beginning with DSM-IV, we included a new subtype of ADHD, and that was the predominantly inattentive type. This type had not been included in DSM-IIIR, and its inclusion resulted in an expansion of the definition of ADHD, and that expansion resulted in a near doubling of the prevalence of ADHD, which is now seen to be about 7.7% of children in the United States, which would translate to a figure of about 3 to 4 million children. Now, we know that ADHD occurs in adults as well, and we can see that in the adult population, about 4 to 5% of U.S. adults have ADHD. In other words, about 2/3 of the prevalence of ADHD in children persists into ADHD in adults. Based on current census figures, this would translate to about 12 to 15 million adults in the U.S. currently have ADHD. By the way, studies have shown, such as that of the National Comorbidity Survey, that only about 10% of adults with ADHD have ever been diagnosed or treated specifically for this disorder. so that the vast majority of adults with ADHD go undiagnosed and untreated in the United States at the moment. Now, if we look at the worldwide prevalence figures for child and adult ADHD, we can see that about 5.5% of children worldwide have the disorder, and about 3 to 4% of adults worldwide qualify for ADHD. Notice that these figures are slightly lower than the prevalence in the United States, and that is because ADHD appears to be slightly more prevalent in developed countries than it is in undeveloped or underdeveloped countries. The reason for this may have to do with greater medical care, and especially greater care of neonates, and particularly neonates that are born prematurely. That is, developed countries are more likely to be able to save babies that previously might have died in undeveloped or underdeveloped countries. And this saving of babies may result in a slight increase in prevalence of ADHD in the United States or in developed countries more generally. Whatever the reason, we can see that developed countries have slightly greater ADHD than undeveloped countries. Now, ADHD varies as a function of several demographic factors. First of all, ADHD, as is evident above, is much more common in younger individuals than it is in older individuals, and it continues to decline somewhat with age, even after age 30. It is also more common in certain social classes, particularly in lower middle classes or in blue-collar classes. The prevalence of ADHD is slightly, though significantly higher than in other social classes. The reason for this probably has to do with the fact that ADHD interferes with education, and therefore individuals growing up with ADHD are likely to get less education, and by adulthood are therefore likely to find themselves in somewhat lower social classes and in lower occupational classes than are individuals who might not have ADHD and who may have gotten more education. We also know that ADHD is much more common in very densely populated urban areas than it is in suburban or rural areas. Now, we're not referring here to referral rates of the disorder. We're referring here instead to actual incidence or true prevalence of the disorder. We may find that more people with ADHD are referred for treatment or for diagnosis and treatment in suburban or wealthy areas, but that doesn't mean that ADHD is more prevalent there. It just means that it's more likely to be identified and referred and treated in those particular areas. But when we look at prevalence of the disorder across the population, it does appear to be more common in dense or inner city areas, that is, densely populated areas, than it is in rural areas. We also know that ADHD may occur in certain populations or certain demographic sectors more than others, and this is especially so with regard to occupations. ADHD appears to be more common in the offspring of military personnel, for instance, than it is in the general population. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the military causing ADHD. It may have to do with the fact that when individuals with ADHD are growing up and are choosing careers, they may opt into the military as a career choice at a greater frequency than would other individuals. And this most likely has to do with the fact I've already mentioned, and that is that they're less likely to pursue advanced education than are other individuals. And the military is one of many good choices that they might make as a career alternative rather than going on to college or to graduate school and getting advanced education. Now, as you can see here, ADHD is found in all ethnic groups and in all countries in which it has been studied. And so it's not exclusively a Western or a developed country disorder. There are only slight variations across ethnic groups in the prevalence of ADHD, and most of these disappear completely when we control for social class differences. However, several studies have recently documented that ADHD may be slightly higher in Hispanic Latino populations than in other ethnic groups. The reason for this is unclear, and the difference in prevalence is very slight, so I don't wish to make a big deal of it here, but other than to note that it has now been found in several different studies, and it's worth pursuing what the reason for that might be. Now, here you can see that ADHD varies in its severity across different situations so that it fluctuates markedly depending upon various factors involved in a situation. On the left-hand side of my slide, you can see that ADHD is less likely to occur, or will occur to a lesser degree or be less severe in the situations listed here on the left, when situations are fun or more interesting, when feedback is more frequent and immediate, when the individual is the sole focus of attention, that is in one-to-one situations where there's a lot of supervision and structure. They're likely to be better behaved earlier in the day than later in the day, and so on down the list, as you see here. They're much more likely to be at their worst or to show more severe symptoms in these situations on the right-hand side of the diagram. In fact, ADHD shows more marked fluctuation across settings than does the behavior of normal individuals, or than might be seen in other disorders. This may be because the situations on the right-hand side of the diagram where they're at their worst are situations that demand a lot more self-regulation than do the situations on the left. And we know that self-regulation is mediated by the executive functions. And since, as I've already said, we have evidence that ADHD is a disorder of executive functioning, it makes perfect sense that situations that tax the executive system or that demand greater self-restraint and self-regulation will be the situations in which they are more likely to show their symptoms or to show more severe symptoms. But all of this is to say that when evaluating someone with ADHD, clinicians should spend less time pursuing information about behavior on the left-hand side of the diagram, because they're likely to be much better off there, and to evaluate situations on the right-hand side of this slide. Now, there are some sex differences that are apparent in ADHD. The first of these is in the prevalence of ADHD. ADHD occurs 3 times more often in male children than in female children. And that's in the general population sample. If we sample clinically referred populations, we will find that the prevalence of males to females is even higher, being about 5 to 1. For some reason, males tend to be referred more often than females to psychiatric and psychological clinics, and that may have to do with the fact that aggression is more common in males than females with ADHD, and it is more disruptive behavior that is likely to get an individual referred for mental health intervention than is more quiescent behavior. But for whatever reason, the disorder does appear to be slightly more common in male children than female children. Now, by adulthood, the prevalence figures are nearly equal. In my own recent study of adults with ADHD, we found that there was no difference in the prevalence of ADHD in men than in women. It's not clear why the prevalence equalizes between the two sexes by adulthood. That's certainly a question worthy of further research. Now, when we study adults or girls with ADHD, and we examine sex differences, we see that there are generally very few sex differences. That is to say, that males and females with ADHD have qualitatively the same disorder. So we don't see a lot of differences in symptoms in the two sexes. What we do see is that the disorder may result in greater impairment in one sex more than the other, based upon the domains of life that individuals select themselves into. So, for instance, if females decide to be stay-at-home mothers, they may report greater impairment in their ability to manage a household, handle daily responsibilities, and raise their children than might ADHD males who have opted to pursue careers. We would see the reverse pattern of impairment in females who have opted to pursue careers rather than remain stay-at-home mothers. And again, if males opted to be stay-at-home fathers and carry the burden of childcare more than mothers, then we might see greater impairment in males in their role as parents. So all of this is to say that impairment appears to be based on the roles that people choose to pursue, whereas we don't necessarily see greater impairment in females than males more generally. Now, there are differences between men and women in the general population. We know that males in general are more prone to antisocial behavior and related drug use and addictive disorders, whereas we know that females are more likely to have greater problems with depression or other mood disorders or anxiety disorders. And we see precisely the same differences in ADHD men and women. That is, females with ADHD are more likely to have higher rates of anxiety and depression than males, whereas males are more likely to have greater incidences of antisocial activities and drug use, not to mention risk-taking more generally. But notice that these differences between ADHD men and women are precisely the same differences that we see between men and women more generally. Now, recent studies have shown that there is a slight increase in the likelihood of having an eating disorder in females with ADHD as they enter adolescence and adulthood. This is not a risk for all eating disorders, but specifically for bulimia, the impulsive eating disorder. That said, I would like to reiterate an important point here, and that is that overall there are very few sex differences between girls and boys and men and women with ADHD. What sex differences we do see are the same sex differences that are present in the general population of men and women. Now, you should all be familiar with the diagnostic criteria that has been published in the DSM-IV. This was published in 1994, and these have been our standard of care for at least the past 17 years. So I'll quickly go through these, but I don't want to spend much time on them because all of you should be familiar with them if you're taking this course and you're a mental health professional. Now, you all know that the diagnostic criteria require that there be at least 6 symptoms, and that these symptoms occur often or more frequently, and that there be 6 symptoms on either the inattention list or the hyperactive impulsive list. These symptoms have to be developmentally excessive for the individual's age. They have to have lasted at least 6 months. They have to be occurring in at least 2 or more situations, such as home, school, or social situations in children, or home, school, work, and social situations in adults. Now, these symptoms have to be producing impairment in major life activities. That is to say that having significant symptoms alone is not sufficient to diagnose an individual with this disorder. The symptoms must be producing impairment in 1 or more major life activities. Now, the DSM criteria require that these symptoms have developed by age 7. We're going to return to this because, as I'll explain in a moment, there is no scientific basis for using this age of onset. Indeed, the DSM-IV field trials, which were published after DSM-IV went to press, found that the age of onset of age 7 was unreliable and inappropriate. Now, the DSM criteria also require that we rule out other disorders that might also be giving rise to some of the symptoms of ADHD before diagnosing a person with ADHD. That is, if one disorder explains the presenting symptoms, then there is no need to add a second disorder to the mix. Now, the DSM also says that ADHD cannot be present in the context of pervasive developmental disorder or autistic spectrum disorders. And of course, I'll mention in a moment that of course is untrue. ADHD can, in fact, occur in the context of autistic spectrum disorders. Again, I think the more important point here is that DSM was emphasizing not to give an excessive number of diagnoses. If the symptoms can be best explained by one diagnosis, then we certainly don't add a second one. Now, the current DSM criteria identify at least 3 subtypes of ADHD, those having excessive inattentive symptoms but not hyperactive ones, called the predominantly inattentive type. The opposite, those having excessive hyperactive and impulsive symptoms but not inattention, and they are the predominantly hyperactive type. And then those having excessive symptoms on both dimensions of symptoms, which would be called the combined type. Now, symptom dimensions that we've been discussing are shown here. This is the inattention symptom list, and it contains 9 symptoms, and the symptoms have to be present at least often or more frequently to be considered a symptom in their own right. Here is the symptom list for the hyperactive impulsive dimension, and again there are 9 symptoms, and they have to be occurring at least often or more frequently to be considered a symptom. Now, currently, the DSM-V committee is meeting to discuss possible changes to these diagnostic criteria. It's expected that the DSM-V criteria will probably be published sometime in the year 2013. That is, if everything stays on schedule. There are a number of issues that have been identified as problematic with the DSM-IV criteria, and in discussing them with you, I'd like to encourage you to try to correct them now, rather than wait and see whether the DSM-V committee is going to correct them and just how they're going to correct them. One of the problems I've already mentioned, and that is that the inattention symptom list actually reflects more than just inattention. That is, it comprises a broader swath of cognitive impairment than the term inattention alone might convey. And in particular, we were discussing the fact that this symptom list likely reflects difficulties in working memory, not just in inattention. And since working memory is one of the major executive functions, it may mean that this inattention list reflects problems with all of the executive difficulties, or all of the executive functions, that is, and not just with working memory. So we need to appreciate the fact that when we evaluate patients with ADHD, the inattention that they're describing may well reflect a broader problem with executive functioning. Now, the second difficulty with the current DSM-IV criteria is that the symptoms of impulsiveness are given short shrift. Only 3 of the 18 symptoms in the DSM list reflect impulsiveness, and all of them have to do with verbal behavior. There are no symptoms of cognitive impulsiveness or of motor, and especially no symptoms of emotional impulsiveness. So the DSM committee is currently entertaining including at least 4 or 5 more symptoms of impulsiveness on the hyperactive impulsive symptom list than is currently seen in DSM-IV, and I certainly hope that they will do so. But nevertheless, clinicians can now appreciate the fact that there is a greater problem with impulsiveness than just verbal impulsiveness, as is reflected on the DSM symptom list. And I described some of these symptoms of impulsiveness earlier in this presentation, such as those of cognitive, motor, and verbal impulsiveness, not to mention emotional impulsiveness as well. Now, as I've already mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the DSM ignores emotion as a domain of impulsiveness in ADHD, and yet we know and have known for several hundred years that emotion is a part of this disorder. So I would encourage clinicians to pay attention to the impulsive emotion that I discussed earlier that goes with this disorder. And we'll see whether or not DSM-V returns emotion into the criteria. But whether it does or not, impulsive emotion and difficulties with emotional self-regulation are a central inherent part of ADHD and are not distinct from it. Now, the symptoms in the DSM-IV, that is, the wording of the symptoms, were developed for children, and they weren't necessarily developed for use with adults. Indeed, there were no adults in the field trial for DSM-IV. And so it's an open question whether the current wording of the symptoms can be used in diagnosing adults, that is, how appropriate they are. And in fact, a number of studies, including my own series of studies published in my 2008 book, ADHD in Adults, What the Science Says. In that book, we found that the symptom phrasing could be better for adults if we were to alter the structure of these symptoms and also include new symptoms that reflect the adult stage of ADHD. And I'll show you a list of those symptoms in a moment. But for now, let's just understand that the current symptoms in DSM-IV are phrased for children and may not be particularly applicable for adults. For instance, adults don't act as if driven by a motor, and adults don't have difficulties playing quietly. And those symptoms certainly need to be rephrased. Now, the threshold for diagnosis on each list, which is to say 6 out of 9 symptoms being the threshold for diagnosis, was also based entirely on children. And it's certainly been made clear by recent studies that it does not apply very well to adults. That is to say that if you were to retain this threshold across development, you would see people outgrowing ADHD. But what we found is that they're outgrowing the diagnostic criteria. They're not outgrowing their disorder, and they remain relatively severe and developmentally inappropriate in their symptoms into adulthood. So if you're going to use the DSM-IV symptom list as it's written, you're going to need to lower the threshold on each symptom list with age. And my own studies have suggested that the symptom threshold of 6 out of 9 symptoms applies best to individuals who are 17 years of age and younger. From 18 years of age up to age 29, 5 symptoms would be a more appropriate threshold. And after age 30, 4 symptoms would be the most appropriate threshold. And if you did this, you would retain the sensitivity of the criteria to the adult stage of the disorder. Now, we also need to understand that these diagnostic cutoffs were developed mainly on boys more than girls. There were at least 2 to 3 times more boys in the field trial for DSM-IV. And since we know that ADHD symptoms occur more frequently in the general male population than female population, what this does is to create a gender bias in the use of the criteria. And that is that when we're evaluating a girl, she has to be more severe than the general population than a boy does. And that's because you're comparing this girl to criteria that were developed on boys. And boys, as we've said, are more likely to show these symptoms even in the general population. To get out of this problem of requiring a more severe criteria for girls than for boys, I encourage you to use rating scales of ADHD symptoms. The rating scales typically come with norms that are broken out separate for boys and for girls. And that means that the rating scale is going to be more accurate in indicating the developmental inappropriateness of the girl than are the DSM-IV criteria. There are various rating scales for children that can be used. The the ADHD-4 rating scale by DuPaul and colleagues, the Vanderbilt rating scale, the Connors rating scale, the ADD-ES rating scale, all of them have norms and have separate norms for children. For adults, there is the Connors Adult Rating Scale and my own Barkley Adult ADHD Rating Scale that is now available. And these come with separate norms for women than for men. And they would allow you to make a more accurate determination of the developmental inappropriateness of women than is the DSM. So all of this is to say that when we evaluate our patients, we should be using rating scales, not just DSM criteria, and this is especially true when we evaluate girls and women. Now, the DSM requires that symptoms have lasted at least 6 months, and this is applied to the more than 200 Axis I disorders. Now, we know that nature simply doesn't work this way, that there isn't the same window of ascertainment or of duration for symptoms across disorders. And it turns out that in ADHD, it might be better to use a 1-year duration of symptoms, and that's particularly so when we evaluate preschoolers. And this is because of several findings. First of all, we know that even normal preschoolers can show some symptoms of ADHD, particularly between 2 and 3 years of age, as they progress through what are known as the terrible 2s and 3s. But these symptoms frequently last only about 3 to 6 months, and therefore they are not a general indication that the individual is going to have ADHD a year or 2 later. Studies of preschoolers indicate that if a child has significant symptoms of ADHD and they have lasted at least a year or more, then they are indicative of a very stable pattern of behavior and suggest an increased risk for being diagnosed as ADHD upon entry into school. And so these results, I think, encourage us to use a 1-year duration of symptoms to make sure that we are identifying a very stable pattern of symptoms and behavior that is a trait of the individual and not simply a situational reaction or a temporary exacerbation of behavior as a result of some developmental stage. Now, the DSM says that symptoms have to be developmentally inappropriate, but it doesn't tell us how inappropriate. I know that it gives you a threshold of six symptoms on each symptom list, but this is strictly for children, And I think we need to apply a threshold that can be extrapolated across the lifespan. Now, it's very common in psychology to use the 1.5 standard deviation threshold above the normal mean as an index of statistical abnormality, which is to say that the individual is rare within the population. Individuals meeting or surpassing this criteria would place at about the 93rd percentile. That is, they would be in the top 7% of the population. And although this is a somewhat arbitrary line in the sand to draw for determining developmental inappropriateness, arbitrary doesn't mean meaningless. Certainly the more severe an individual is, which is to say the further out on the bell curve of symptoms they place relative to the general population, the more severe they are and the more likely they are to be impaired in at least one or more major life activities. And as we've said earlier, it's where impairment begins that disorders begin. But in general, people who surpass the 93rd percentile are highly likely to be impaired in a major life activity. All of this is to say that I think we need to be more precise in telling clinicians what we mean by developmental inappropriateness instead of leaving that phrase relatively vague. Now, on this slide, you'll see some additional problems that we've identified with the DSM-IV criteria and how to correct them. Now, the DSM-IV stipulates that symptoms have to be present across several settings. Many clinicians have taken this to mean that parents and teachers have to agree with each other on the severity of the disorder before a diagnosis can be given, and that certainly is not the case. The DSM was developed by counting the number of different symptoms given by parents and adding to it any additional symptoms, that is, new symptoms, were identified by the teacher. In other words, it's a blending of the reports of the two individuals, an accounting of the number of different symptoms that are present across the different contexts. It does not mean that parents have to report 6 symptoms on either list, and the teachers have to report 6 symptoms on either list before a child can be diagnosed as having ADHD. We simply ask that some symptoms producing impairment be present in more than one situation. We don't ask for parents and teachers to agree with each other. And there's a very good reason for this. When we have studied various behavior rating scales of children's psychological adjustment, such as the Child Behavior Checklist, for instance, we find that the degree of agreement between parents and teachers is only about 0.3. That is a correlation of around 0.25 to 0.3. This is abysmal. It means that the variance shared between parent ratings and teacher ratings is less than 10%. What it really means is that children behave quite differently in the context of school than they do at home. And we should respect this difference and not try to make it part of our diagnostic criteria where it can only muck things up for us. So clinicians should use the DSM the way I have indicated that it was developed, and that is count the number of symptoms reported by one individual, a parent or a teacher, and add to that count any additional symptoms, new symptoms, that were identified by the other individual. And then make sure that you have established that some symptoms producing impairment have been present in both settings during the history of this child. Now, another problem with the DSM is that it does not require corroboration of the reports of the patient by others who know them well. And there's a good reason for that also, and that is that the DSM was developed for children, and children don't refer themselves. They're brought in by someone who knows them well, and that's typically a parent. And therefore the DSM didn't make it explicit that there had to be corroboration of what the patient reports against someone who knows them well. But in evaluating teenagers, and in particularly evaluating adults for ADHD, this should be made obvious. You should corroborate what the individual tells you through someone who knows them well. And the reason for that is that research shows that people with ADHD underreport the severity of their symptoms, and particularly their impairment, up to at least 27 to 30 years of age. After that, their reports begin to converge on the reports of others in terms of the degree of severity. For instance, the correlation between what a teenager says about their ADHD and what their parents will report is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2. In other words, it's quite abysmal. The correlation between what someone at age 20 will say and what their parents will say is double that, about 0.2 to 0.25. Now that correlation doubles again when we get up to around age 27 to 30. Here the correlation between what an adult reports and what others who know them well report about them is about 0.74, which is quite good and is the typical correlation that we see from there on between the reports of adults about their ADHD symptoms and others who know them well, such as a parent or a spouse or a close friend. So let me reiterate this very important point. When you're evaluating individuals who have ADHD and they're below 27 years of age at a minimum, you need to corroborate what the patient reports about their symptoms through another individual who has known them well. In the case of children, this of course is going to be parents and teachers. In the case of adults, it's going to be the people I've already mentioned, most likely cohabiting partners or spouses, close friends, parents, or siblings. Now, DSM has a problem, and I hope that it will address it in DSM-V. Certainly there is a committee that has been appointed to study this issue. The DSM requires that impairment be a criterion for every Axis 1 disorder, or nearly every one as far as I know. But it doesn't define what it means by the term impairment. And as a result, clinicians have been using a variety of standards for this criterion. For instance, some people believe that an impairment exists if a person performs in school well below their IQ. That is, in some area of academic achievement, if their performance is below that of their intelligence, this is an index of impairment. This sort of disparity or discrepancy between IQ and academic achievement. You can see where this came from. It used to be used as a criterion for establishing the presence of a learning disability. It, of course, has been severely criticized in research on learning disabilities, and in many areas is no longer being used as the standard for diagnosing a learning disability. Instead, it's simply been replaced by substandard or sub-average performance on an academic achievement test, typically falling somewhere below the 7th to 10th percentile. But you can see where this would create havoc in the diagnosis of a psychiatric disorder, because IQ is not an index of how well an individual is supposed to do in all walks of life or in all areas of performance. It certainly isn't an index of how well you should be doing in your artistic or musical ability or spatial mechanical abilities, nor is it an index of how an individual should be performing in their particular academic subjects, such as biochemistry in medical school. Now, another criteria or standard for impairment that has been used by clinicians is comparison to a highly specialized peer group. For instance, you may be evaluating someone in graduate school, such as in medical or law school, and they tell you that they can't function as well as other medical students or law students, and you take this report to be an indication that the individual is impaired. But high-octane or high-performance peer groups or highly specialized peer groups are not part of the standard for establishing impairment. Instead, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the courts and others have established that impairment is defined relative to the average or normal person in the population, not to some high performance or specialized peer group. And therefore, how one is doing relative to other medical students or law students is not an index of impairment. It is how well one is doing relative to the general population. And so I think clinicians need to be cautioned to use what is called the average person standard in determining whether impairment exists. Otherwise, it makes a mockery of the word impairment and the term disorder. After all, disorders, by definition, mean that you are disordered or disturbed or impaired relative to normal, not relative to highly gifted or highly educated individuals. Now, I know this raises a quandary for people who evaluate very accomplished individuals, for instance, people who do evaluations of college or graduate students. But it shouldn't, because the way out of this quandary is to examine the person's life outside of school and establish impairment in one of the many other domains that is non-educational. For instance, how is the individual doing in managing their money, in their addictive behavior, in raising their children? How have they done previously in other work settings? How are they doing with regard to their ability to deal with their health and health maintenance? In other words, examine the paper trail of impairment in non-educational settings and make sure that impairment is established there, and don't just focus on how they're doing in this very specialized educational setting. And usually when you do this, you can establish that impairment exists in a non-educational setting, and therefore the individual qualifies for the diagnosis, even if they're a highly gifted or intelligent individual. So don't just focus on school performance in establishing impairment. Now we come back to the point that I made earlier, which is that the age 7 criteria in DSM-IV lacks any validity. Field trials done with the DSM-IV criteria showed that establishing the age of onset by age 7 resulted in greater unreliability of the diagnosis. Certainly, a number of studies, including my own, shows that individuals cannot reliably report the onset of their symptoms. For instance, children whose onset of symptoms had been established as developing by 6 years of age were followed in my Milwaukee longitudinal study for 20 years, and then they were interviewed again as to when they thought their disorder had developed. And of course, they reported an onset of symptoms all over the developmental map. And in general, they reported an onset of their symptoms at least 4 years later than had actually been established in their childhood years at entry into the project. This is also true of the parents of these individuals as well. So given the unreliability of age 7 and the fact that nearly a third of ADHD children don't develop their symptoms until after age 7, and that more than half of adults with ADHD don't develop their symptoms until after this age, the age 7 criteria should be abandoned. Now, DSM-V is entertaining using 12 years of age as the threshold or the criterion for age of onset. This is certainly better than age 7, and it will capture more cases of ADHD than did age 7. But I believe that no age of onset that is precise should be put in the criteria itself, and instead the phrase onset in childhood or adolescence should be used. Because after all, no mental disorder develops with such precision that it would develop by a specific year of age. And that's as much true of age 12 as it is of age 7. So I think specifying a precise age misleads clinicians into thinking that nature is very precise in the onset of disorders, and clearly it is not. Now, for my money, I think that the text of DSM-V should specify that the onset should be prior to 16 years of age. But in the criteria itself, it should say onset in childhood or adolescence. The reason I choose 16 years of age is that research shows that over 99% of individuals with ADHD, whether in childhood or adulthood, will report the onset of their symptoms by or before 16 years of age. So age 16 captures nearly everyone who's going to develop ADHD rather than age 12. But as clinicians, be aware of the fact that age 7 has no validity. Now, on the next slide, I want to show you some of the symptoms that we identified in a research project that we did. It took us about 7 years to do this project, and we evaluated 91 new items for adult ADHD besides the 18 that are in the DSM-IV. And most of these 91 items came from various theories and models of executive functioning, and were designed to represent the 7 major executive functions that have been identified by many of these models. As I've said, you can take my course on executive functioning to learn more about those constructs. But suffice to say that we generated these 91 items, and then we evaluated a large group of adults with ADHD, a large group of clinical control adults that didn't have ADHD but were seen in the same outpatient psychiatric clinic, and a normal population sample. And using various statistical procedures, we were able to show that the following 9 symptoms were the best for discriminating ADHD from these other 2 control groups. And you can see here that most of these are not symptoms that are in the DSM-IV. Only a few of these symptoms are DSM-IV symptoms, and they predominantly come off the inattention list. There were no symptoms of hyperactivity that distinguished adults with ADHD from these other control groups, which is why I cautioned you earlier not to pay attention to hyperactivity as a diagnostic symptom after adolescence or adulthood. And now you can see why. It is symptoms of inattentiveness, and particularly problems with working memory and other executive functions, as well as difficulties with impulsiveness, that identify the adult with ADHD. Now, further statistical analyses of our data showed that a threshold of 4 of the first 7 symptoms was diagnostic of adult ADHD, or a threshold of 6 out of all 9 symptoms. Now, I've listed the symptoms in their descending order of ability to discriminate ADHD from other disorders. And that's why I can say that it can be 4 out of the first 7 or 6 out of the first 9 symptoms. So, look for these symptoms, look for either of these diagnostic thresholds, and then look for the onset of symptoms that produced impairment sometime in childhood or adolescence, certainly before 12 to 16 years of age. And you'll be doing a very good job of identifying adults with ADHD. In fact, you'll be doing a better job than is the case with DSM-IV. Now, the DSM-V committee is aware of these symptoms, and in their proposals to change DSM are thinking about including these in parentheses to clarify the existing ADHD symptom list, that is, the existing 18 symptoms. I, for one, don't think that's a very good idea, because when we tested these items, they weren't in parentheses after the more traditional 18 symptoms. They were symptoms that were evaluated in their own right, and not as parenthetical clarifications. So I don't think that's a useful way to go about doing this. I think that these should be a separate list of symptoms for diagnosis of adult ADHD from the criteria being used for children with ADHD. And I hope you'll use them that way. Now, the DSM says that there are at least 3 subtypes of ADHD. There is the combined type, which has significant symptoms, at least 6 or more symptoms, on both symptom lists, that is, the inattention and the hyperactive impulsive list. But research shows that the combined type and the other 2 types do not comprise 3 different kinds of ADHD. In fact, most research shows that the subtyping approach in DSM-IV is pretty useless, and that is that ADHD forms a single disorder along a single dimension in the general population. And what gets people classified into these different types is simply severity of ADHD and not some qualitative difference across types. So, we've begun to look lately in our research for whether there might be better ways, more clinically useful ways, of subtyping ADHD. And the answer seems to be yes. Excuse me. One approach to subtyping might be to take the combined type of ADHD and to break it into those who have conduct disorder and those who don't. Now, we know that between 25 and 45% of individuals with ADHD develop conduct disorder, and when they develop it, it is the early onset type of conduct disorder. It often arises before age 12, and sometimes even in the early elementary grades. Research shows that ADHD individuals with conduct disorder differ from those without conduct disorder in a number of important respects. It's not simply additive, that is, adding the symptoms of one to the symptoms of the other. What the research shows is that both disorders, when they occur in the individuals who are comorbid for both disorders, that each disorder arises earlier than it would had it been seen alone. Also, both disorders are more severe than would be the case had either arisen alone. And both disorders are likely to persist over time into adolescence than they would had either disorder occurred alone. These are very important differences. Other differences are that individuals who have both ADHD and conduct disorder are much more likely to persist in their antisocial activities into adulthood than those who have only conduct disorder or only ADHD. And also, people with both disorders are more likely to come from families where there's greater psychiatric disturbance, particularly greater antisocial personality, greater antisocial behavior, greater drug use, and depression than is the case when either disorder is seen alone. And finally, another important difference is that at least 1 in 5 of individuals with this comorbidity of ADHD with conduct disorder are likely to have psychopathy. That is, they're likely to show a significant pattern of callous, unemotional traits, lack of conscience, lack of empathy, lack of guilt and remorse, and an under-aroused pattern of emotional responding to stressful or conflict situations. So there are even apparently psychophysiological differences between individuals with the comorbid pattern of ADHD and conduct disorder than those who have either disorder alone. So I think all of this suggests that we should do what the Europeans have been doing in the ICD criteria for quite some time, which is to distinguish a type of ADHD as different when conduct disorder occurs with it. Now, the second type of ADHD in the DSM-IV that is not useful is the hyperactive impulsive type. This is not useful because many of these individuals are simply early childhood cases of the combined type. And if you follow them over time, eventually they develop at least 6 symptoms of ADHD inattention and therefore will progress on to being diagnosed with the combined type. So what we're really seeing here is that the hyperactive type is a preschool stage to the combined type in most cases. It's not a different type. Now, there's a second group that gets put into this subtype, and those are individuals who happen to fall just 1 or 2 symptoms short on the inattention list. That is, they have 4 or 5 symptoms of inattention. And therefore they have to be called hyperactive type because they just don't have enough inattention symptoms. And yet these people have at least 10 or 11 symptoms of the combined type. So they shouldn't be viewed as a separate type of ADHD. They should be viewed as a subthreshold or milder form of the combined type and not as a separate type at all. Now, a third group of individuals who are likely to be put into this hyperactive impulsive type are young preschool children who only have oppositional symptoms and are not ADHD. And the reason they wind up being called ADHD is that parents frequently confuse the symptoms of both disorders and tend to overestimate the degree of their children's ADHD symptoms if their child has oppositional disorder. Teachers are much less likely to make this sort of confusion among the symptoms, but parents do so. And so what happens is you have a very young child who may be oppositional and whose parents may rate them on rating scales or report in interviews that they have symptoms of ADHD, when in fact they really don't. And as the oppositional disorder resolves, then what we see is a decline and a disappearance of the ADHD symptoms as well. So we want to make sure that these children are not included in the diagnostic category of ADHD. Now, on the next slide, we want to talk about the inattentive subtype of ADHD, often called ADD. By the way, I happen to disagree with that because ADD is the term that was used for all of ADHD back in the 1980s, and continuing to use it now for only the inattentive type just creates, I think, confusion. But in any case, the predominantly inattentive type of ADHD is also really not a type of ADHD. Here again, we find that at least half or more of people in this inattentive type were formerly combined type individuals. But as they grew up, their symptoms of hyperactivity declined, as I've mentioned earlier, which is typical. And as a result, they got to a point where they no longer had 6 symptoms of hyperactivity. According to the DSM rules, you have to reclassify them as in the inattentive type. But they really haven't changed subtypes at all. So my advice to you is that when you evaluate individuals, if they ever met criteria for the combined type, then that's what they have, and they're not changing types purely as a function of age. Now, a second set of individuals is the group we've already talked about under the hyperactive type, and these are people who wind up being just 1 or 2 symptoms short of getting a diagnosis of the combined type. And that is, in this case, they have only 4 or 5 symptoms of hyperactivity and 6 or more symptoms of inattention, so they get called inattentive type. But you can see that they have at least 10 or 11 symptoms of the combined type, and therefore they should be viewed as just milder or subthreshold forms of the combined type. Now, when you remove these 2 groups from people called inattentive type of ADHD, you're left with a group of individuals who are quite unique, in my opinion, usually comprising at least 30% and sometimes 50% of people called the inattentive type. Researchers have called this group of individuals SCT for sluggish cognitive tempo. And we believe that these individuals have a qualitatively different type of disorder than is the inattentive seen in ADHD. In other words, they don't have ADHD at all. But because there's no other attention disorder in the DSM, they wind up getting put in with the ADHD individuals. So DSM-V is currently looking at what to do with these individuals and whether they should have separate criteria for them, what their name should be, and even whether they should be classified along with ADHD as part of the disruptive behavior disorders. Because as you'll see, they really do not have much comorbidity for the other 2 disruptive disorders, which are oppositional and cognitive. Now let's take a close look at this subset of individuals that we are calling SCT. First of all, we see that the symptoms that they manifest, that is, their inattentiveness, is quite different than the symptoms seen on the ADHD symptom list. And you have to ask about them, because if you only interview them for the DSM-IV symptoms, you'll miss this group of individuals. But their symptoms, in some cases, appear to be the opposite of what we see in ADHD. That is to say, they're hypoactive, they're slow-moving, they're sleepy, lethargic, motorically sluggish. And in their attention, they are daydreamy, they stare a lot, they appear to be spacey, easily mentally confused or mentally foggy, and generally appear to be more inwardly attentive to their thoughts than outwardly attentive. But whatever the case, they've often been referred to as having a sluggish cognitive processing or timing of processing in the way they process information. Now, research shows that these SCT dimensions or symptoms form 2 different dimensions that are highly correlated with each other. One is the daydreaming dimension listed above, and the second is the second line you see above, which is more of a slow-moving, lethargic style. And there may be important correlates to each of these 2 dimensions, but for now let's understand that SCT has been identified as involving both of these dimensions. Now, research shows, what little has been done, that individuals with SCT appear to be very prone to processing mistakes. That is, they make a lot of errors in information processing tasks. Whereas ADHD individuals don't make so many errors. They just don't finish the task. That is, they don't get a lot of their work done. In other words, ADHD is a productivity disorder, amount of work done in unit time, whereas SCT appears to be an accuracy disorder, how information is being selected, filtered, and processed accurately. So, research would therefore suggest that people with SCT have a problem in the domain of selective or focused attention, that is, selecting what's important from what isn't in an ongoing array of information, rather than a problem with persistence and resistance to distraction. As we said, there's at least 6 different attention networks in the brain, and it looks like people with SCT have an impairment in a different attention network than those with ADHD. Research shows that people with SCT have very slow reaction times. They make more omission errors on continuous performance tests. That is, they fail to detect a target when a target goes by. And so instead of being impulsive and making lots of commission errors and responding very quickly, they show a very sluggish and inaccurate processing style. We also see that unlike ADHD combined type, this sluggish style is cross-situational. That is, it affects their performance in multiple situations that involve information processing. And as we're going to describe in a moment, it may be that SCT involves a certain kind of excessive form of normal mind wandering. And I'll return to this idea that SCT is pathological mind wandering in just a moment. Now, on the next slide, we see a few more distinguishing characteristics of SCT from ADHD, and one of those is in their social profile. And that is that people with SCT appear to be slightly reticent, apprehensive, a bit shy, and socially withdrawn compared to normal or compared to ADHD individuals. ADHD individuals are often very intrusive, talkative, disruptive, and certainly very active and emotional. And as a consequence of these aggressive, emotional, and active symptoms, they are frequently socially rejected. Whereas SCT children do have friends. They may not have as many friends as normal children, but they certainly have more friends than ADHD children. But their social profile is characterized as one of being sort of socially passive, quiet, and perhaps a bit shy or withdrawn. Research shows that people with SCT do not have difficulties with motor inhibition. They are not impulsive. If anything, they may be overly inhibited rather than under-inhibited, as we see in ADHD. There's little evidence for executive functioning deficits on tests of executive functioning associated with SCT, where there's a lot more evidence that people with ADHD perform poorly on executive function tests, though even here, not necessarily all people with ADHD perform poorly on those tests. And once again, I'll encourage you to take my course on ADHD and executive functioning to find out more about that issue. Where rating scales of executive functioning and daily life are collected, we do find that people with SCT have higher rates of executive difficulties, but nowhere near what is seen in conjunction with ADHD. Their biggest problem appears to be in self-organization and problem-solving rather than in the domains of time management, inhibition, self-motivation, and so on. I'll show you a graph of this in a moment from a study that I've completed on adults with SCT. But for now, suffice to say here that SCT is associated with a much lower pattern of deficits in executive functioning than would be seen in those with ADHD. And that is a much less severe set of executive. Now, other distinguishing features of SCT include a low rate of comorbidity with oppositional and conduct disorder, much lower than is seen in ADHD combined type. We also find that when parents of these children are interviewed about parenting stress, ADHD parents report stress that is virtually ubiquitous across a variety of home and public situations because their children are so difficult to handle. Whereas parents of SCT children report principally being concerned about their children's school performance. And outside of school, these parents report little or no distress. They report that their children are usually well behaved, good-natured, and not posing difficulties for them in managing them in non-educational settings. Interesting, some studies suggest that SCT is more likely to be affiliated with symptoms of anxiety than is ADHD. Now, don't misunderstand the point. Both disorders are more prone to anxiety disorders. For instance, at least 25% of ADHD individuals are likely to qualify for an anxiety disorder. But this is more true of people with SCT, so that they have more significant anxiety symptoms and are more likely to have an anxiety disorder than do individuals with ADHD. Nevertheless, the majority of people with SCT don't have anxiety disorders, just as the majority of people with ADHD do not do so. It is not clear whether depression is linked more with SCT than with ADHD. Both groups appear to experience a higher risk for depression, being about 20 to 25% or higher, with the risk of depression growing with age. Whenever you see a question mark on my slides, by the way, that indicates that the body of evidence is quite thin and not sufficient for us to reach a relatively definitive conclusion about the matter. And that is certainly true with the association of depression with ADHD, or with SCT, excuse me. Now, as I've said above, when we look at the general domains of impairment associated with SCT in children, it is principally the educational domain that parents report as the most impaired domain, with usually minimal impairment in other domains of performance. When we look at the school performance of these two groups of children, that is ADHD and SCT, we see a somewhat different pattern of problems and mistakes. People with ADHD are likely to be criticized as not getting a lot of work done. That is, they have a productivity disorder. What work they do is generally relatively correct. That is, they're about 85% correct, which is only about 10% below the level of accuracy of normal students when they do their work. SCT, on the other hand, is associated with much higher rates of inaccuracy and much lower rates of lack of productivity. So that is to say that people with SCT may get more work done or even all of their work done, but a larger percentage of the problems they attempt are wrong in their answers than we see in ADHD. So while I may be oversimplifying here, suffice to say that ADHD is a production disorder and SCT is more of an accuracy disorder. Now, there have been a couple of studies that have looked at the pattern of learning disabilities that may link up with these two attention disorders. And it suggests, though again not definitively, that math disorders might be more associated with SCT, whereas handwriting disorders, reading and listening comprehension disorders, and reading disabilities may be more associated with ADHD, but certainly more research is needed on that issue. A study that I did more than 15 years ago suggested that people with the inattentive or SCT type of ADHD came from families with a greater history of anxiety disorders and learning disabilities, whereas children with ADHD came from families that had more ADHD, of course, more antisocial behavior, more conduct disorder, more drug use, and more depression. So it appeared in our study that the family histories and possibly the family genetics of these two disorders may be quite different. But again, more research would be helpful. Now, recently, I have just finished a study of SCT in adults, and this is a study that came out of a large population survey that we did of more than 1,240 adults randomly sampled across the U.S. and representative of the U.S. population. And in this study, we were surveying for symptoms of both ADHD and SCT. But we were also collecting information on executive functioning using a rating scale and also on impairment in major life activities. And I'll show you some data from this study in a moment. But one of the conclusions that came out of this study is that people with SCT had a later age of onset of their symptoms than people with ADHD had. So ADHD may have an earlier age of onset. The age of onset was about 5 to 10 years later for SCT than for ADHD. We found no sex differences in the population in SCT symptoms, and as I've already mentioned, we didn't find any in ADHD symptoms either. We did see a slight decline in ADHD symptoms with age between ages 18 and 92 in this study, and that was particularly so for the hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, but particularly hyperactivity. And that's consistent with what we were seeing in childhood, and that is that across childhood there is a decline in hyperactivity, and this study suggests that it continues throughout life. When we identified people as having a disorder of SCT, that is to say they had at least 5 or more symptoms of SCT that I showed you earlier, which places them, by the way, above the 95th percentile of the adult population, we found that about 5.8% of individuals had adult SCT. And if we included a requirement that they be impaired in at least one or more major activities, it reduced this figure down to about 4.8%. So it looks like on average about 5% of adults in the U.S. have SCT. Now we were able to establish that SCT was a distinct disorder from ADHD, and one way we did that was by looking at what the overlap was between SCT and people who qualified for ADHD, that is, people who had symptoms that were at the 95th percentile or higher on either symptom list of ADHD. And here's what we found. And that is that 54% of the cases of ADHD that we had also qualified for a diagnosis of SCT. So about half of the people with one disorder have the other disorder. And you can see that on the second line as well. Now this was particularly so for people who had been called ADHD inattentive type. There we found that 76% of people diagnosed as inattentive type ADHD actually had SCT. And what that suggests is that this is misdiagnosis taking place. and that is that people with SCT are being inappropriately identified as inattentive type ADHD, or to put it differently, that the inattentive type of ADHD is actually SCT and not a part of ADHD. But nevertheless, what we find here is that the two disorders appear to show a pattern that is more characteristic of comorbidity between two disorders. That is, each disorder can occur alone, and often does, but they can also overlap, as may be the case in up to half of the cases of each disorder. So, it's a pattern of comorbidity, very much like that seen between anxiety disorders and depression. Anxiety and depression are highly correlated, and people who have one often have the other, and yet there are also a number of instances in which people can have either alone. Now, here is the pattern from my executive function rating scale for the groups of adults that we identified in this study. And my rating scale, which is the Barkley Deficits in Executive Functioning Scale, which is available through my publisher, this scale identifies 5 dimensions of symptoms of executive functioning deficits in adults ages 18 to 90 years of age. And we were able to identify 4 groups in this sample of U.S. adults. There's the control group, which had neither SCT or ADHD. There's those in the red bar who had only SCT but did not meet the criteria for ADHD. There are those who had the opposite, that is, they had ADHD but not SCT. And notice in the light blue bar those who were comorbid, who had both disorders. Now, the first, thing that jumps out at you here from this pattern on this figure is that people who are comorbid with both disorders have the greatest impairments in executive functioning, and that's the light blue bar that you see here. And on virtually every measure of executive functioning deficits across these 5 dimensions, people with the comorbid disorders are worse. But what we're really interested here is a comparison between the 2 disorders that are pure cases of disorder, ADHD only and SCT only. So when you look at the red and the yellow bars, you can see that people with SCT are as or more impaired in self-organization and problem solving in that dimension of executive deficits than are people in the control group, or than are people with ADHD. So we can at least say that both of these disorders, SCT and ADHD, are equally impairing of this aspect of executive functioning. And SCT, in fact, may even be slightly more impairing. Now, when we look at time management, we also see that both groups are nearly as impaired when the disorder occurs alone, and then when it occurs comorbidly, it's even worse. And as we look on down the scale here, we can see that where either disorder occurs alone, it is equally as impairing as the other disorder. And when it is comorbid, it is much more severe. So all of this is to say that SCT may be as or more impairing of executive functioning and daily life activities as is ADHD. And it may be even more impairing in self-organization than ADHD. But when both disorders occur coincidentally, that is, occur comorbidly, that is when we see the worst deficits in executive functioning. Now, here are the results for another rating scale using the same sample of people in our population study. This is from the Barkley Functional Impairment Scale, which is a new rating scale of impairment. Indeed, it's the only rating scale of impairment on which there are national norms, and it was published in May of this year, 2011. Here you see 15 major life activities that are surveyed on the scale, and again we see a comparison of the 4 groups of patients. Now, once again, we see that where SCT and ADHD are comorbid, the light blue bar, it is the most impairing condition. So comorbid disorders are more impairing than when either SCT or ADHD occur alone. Generally, we see that ADHD is slightly more impairing than SCT in most of these major life activities. For instance, when we take a look at driving, or at managing money, or at self-care, or take a look at social relationships such as with strangers and with friends, we see that ADHD, the yellow bar, is higher than the red bar. On the other hand, we also see what's called a double dissociation here. There are instances where SCT was more impairing than ADHD, and I've placed an asterisk above 3 of these bars, and they have to do with work or occupational functioning, where we see SCT is more impairing than even ADHD. Notice under education, the red bar is higher than the yellow bar. Here again, SCT apparently is more impairing in the educational domain in the lives of these people than is ADHD only. And then look over under sexual behavior and sexual relationships with others, where again we see that SCT may be slightly more impairing for some reason than is ADHD. But again, I want to emphasize, when both disorders coexist with each other, then that is the more impairing condition, is the comorbid condition. Finally, look at my last asterisk over on child care, the far right-hand dimension of this graph. You can see here now a somewhat different pattern. It is ADHD that interferes with child rearing more than SCT. Whether ADHD occurs alone, that's the yellow bar, or whether it occurs comorbid with SCT, that's the blue bar, both of those bars are distinctly higher than the red bar, which is SCT alone. So again, in child rearing, ADHD may be the more impairing disorder. All of this is to say that SCT appears to be a distinct disorder of attention from ADHD, but it is a disorder that may at times coexist with, overlap with, or as we say, be comorbid with ADHD, in about half of all cases, in fact. Now, in looking at the symptoms of SCT, it suggests that SCT might be a problem with arousal. So perhaps it is a brainstem difficulty. We're not sure of that, but certainly lethargy, sleepiness, underarousal, sluggishness, moving slowly, all suggest an underaroused or underactivated pattern of behavior. It's also possible that SCT might be a problem with mind wandering, giving rise to the problems with daydreaming, staring, being inwardly pensive and preoccupied, and the other inattention symptoms that I mentioned earlier. Mind wandering is a condition that has been studied in the normal population, and all of us engage in mind wandering. For instance, when we're doing something relatively routine and automatic, our executive system, our working memory, our minds, that is to say, may wander on to other topics, particularly other problems that we anticipate coming up later in the day, and we therefore start to brainstorm ideas about what to do, or perhaps we simply start to engage in escape, where we start to think about things that are more desirable or that we wish we were doing instead of the routine task. This is all well and good, as long as it doesn't interfere with performance of the primary task that we are engaged in. But when mind wandering starts to interfere with the primary task, it becomes dysfunctional or pathological, and therefore it may be a disorder. Now, certainly there are a number of papers, particularly by Smallwood, that have been published lately on mind wandering and the possibility that in some instances it is pathological or dysfunctional. The reason I raise it here is that Adams and Milich and others working at the University of Kentucky recently raised the possibility that the symptoms of SCT may actually reflect a pathological form of mind wandering. The daydream, the staring, the spaciness, the mental confusion and fogginess, the inward preoccupation may all be outward signs of what is mind wandering. And when mind wandering becomes excessive and interferes with primary task performance, then it may well be a disorder. And it may well interfere with executive functioning. Now, it's important to understand here that mind wandering isn't a primary disorder of executive functioning. It's a primary disorder of prioritizing how one is using the executive system for problem solving or for thinking about other activities. So let's just understand that when the individual is engaged excessively in mind wandering, it diminishes their ability to use their executive functioning capacities for the primary goal-directed task that they're involved in. And therefore it slows down their progress toward the goal because it's interfering with goal performance. Now, it's possible that this SCT, or mind wandering, in some people is a form of escape avoidance learning. That is, that they're engaged in a primary task, they're not very happy with it, it's relatively boring, tedious, effortful, or frankly aversive and unpleasant, and their mind starts to wander off onto something more pleasant, so that mind wandering is a form of escape. Again, as I said, this is fine unless the escape avoidant learning is now interfering with accomplishing the primary task. It's also possible, as in SCT, that this type of mental escape avoidance mind wandering is a result of anxiety that is induced by the primary task. That is, the individual is engaging in something that they don't find interesting and that they in fact find fear-inducing, and they worry about it, and then their mind starts to wander in order to escape the anxiety or aversiveness of the task. This might in fact explain why SCT is seen in conjunction with anxiety disorders. So here we see that mind wandering is a form of escape from anxiety rather than just an escape from boredom as it was in the first instance on this slide. Finally, it's also possible that SCT, or excessive mind wandering, is ruminative. And this is quite different from escape avoidance. This is where the individual becomes excessively preoccupied with problems that they're having in their life, or with previous failures or situations in which they may have been upset or even humiliated, and it tends to dominate their thinking. And therefore they're unable to give their full mental capacity, their full executive functioning to the primary task. This might be seen in instances where the individual has an anxiety disorder and is worried about something in their life and is ruminating about it. It might be seen as an instance of obsessive thinking, as an obsessive compulsive disorder. Might even be seen in instances of psychosis or thought disorder, where the individual engages in excessive fantasy and rumination rather than paying attention to external reality. All of these would be instances in which SCT is ruminative. So for now, until we understand more about SCT and mind wandering, clinicians should question their patients who appear to have high rates of SCT symptoms about the nature of their mind wandering. Just what is it they're thinking about when they are off task and daydreaming and spacing out and appearing to be mentally foggy. And that may help with differential diagnosis among these possible pathways into SCT. Now, some research has been done with SCT with regard to treatment response. Not much, and I want to emphasize all the question marks that you see here on the slide indicating very little research for these ideas. But let's go through them anyway, because there have been some studies that can guide us on this. For instance, most of the research has been done on testing the use of stimulant medications with ADHD that are now applied to SCT, or inattentive only ADHD. And what we find with these SCT individuals is that they don't respond as well to the medication. They're not adversely affected by it, and you can go ahead and try the stimulants with them. But you won't be impressed with the degree of improvement in most of your patients. Instead, what you're likely to find is a very, very modest degree of improvement, and only about 20% of the people in my study of methylphenidate with SCT showed marked enough improvement to stay on their medication. So stimulants might be useful for these people, but we found that it wasn't useful for very many of them. The degree of improvement was unimpressive, and where the response occurred, it occurred at the lowest doses, the starting doses in our study. All of this suggests that there may be a different dose-response profile of people with SCT to stimulants than is seen in ADHD, where between 75 and 90% of people show an improvement in their symptoms sufficient to warrant continuing on their stimulant medication. Now, a few studies have suggested that children with SCT may be better responders to social skills training than children with ADHD. The track record of social skills training for ADHD is not very impressive. In fact, I don't recommend it routinely, even though children with ADHD often have problems with getting along with other children. Indeed, many of them are rejected by other children. Social skills training does not appear to be a particularly effective way of addressing their social relationship difficulties. And what we find is that fewer than 25% of them appear to respond well to social skills training. Interestingly, another 25% of ADHD cases are actually made worse by social skills training. And this is due to a process known as deviancy training. When you mix non-aggressive and aggressive children together, the aggressive children train up the other children in becoming more aggressive. In other words, it makes the other children worse. And that has been seen in cases of social skills training, in studies of social skills training, that is. And so not only do ADHD children not get better from social skills training in their social relationships, but a subset of them may in fact get worse, particularly if you are mixing aggressive and non-aggressive groups together. Now, we've known for decades that social skills training is most likely to benefit children and adults who are shy, withdrawn, and anxious. And it benefits them even more than it does people with disruptive behavior disorders. And so what we're seeing here may just be a replay of what we've already seen in other areas of the psychological literature. Social skills training works best for individuals who are somewhat withdrawn, apprehensive, anxious, or shy. And that would certainly be our SCT population. And therefore, SCT kids may do better in social skills training. There's only one study of behavior modification with SCT children specifically, and that was Feifner's study in 2007, in which he studied a joint homeschool behavior modification program that targeted the difficulties that SCT children were having with attention, with their organizational skills. And she did find that these behavior management programs were effective at helping to improve the school behavior and the home behavior of these SCT children. And it improved them as well or better than was seen in ADHD children. The MTA study also found that anxious children with ADHD were the most likely to respond to their psychosocial treatment program as well. Given that SCT children are the most anxious ADHD children, then it may be, again, that we could reason that behavior management might be a useful thing to try for SCT, and they may even respond better to behavior management programs than ADHD children. Now, cognitive therapy for ADHD children turned out to be a failure, and decades of research on it found that it was not particularly useful for children with ADHD. That is, teaching children who are impulsive to talk to themselves as a form of self-control did not work very well, and so we abandoned it generally as a form of treatment. Now, studies recently have shown that cognitive therapy does help adult ADHD as a supplement to their medication, in boosting their medication effects and in helping them to address many of their executive functioning problems in daily life. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bath here and mislead you into thinking that cognitive behavior therapy isn't helpful at all for ADHD, but it's only helpful when we get to adulthood ADHD and not for children. On the other hand, as I've just tried to explain to you, SCT is not ADHD, and so the research on ADHD and cognitive therapy may not be pertinent to SCT at all. And so I would encourage you to return to studying the notion that perhaps cognitive therapy might be useful for SCT when it occurs in children and adults. We know that we know that cognitive therapy is very effective for anxiety disorders and also effective for depression. And since both of these may occur more often in SCT, certainly anxiety does, then cognitive therapy might be useful for SCT. So let's return and revisit the possibility that cognitive therapy might be a useful intervention for SCT and not conclude that it isn't on the basis of research on ADHD. Now, there are no other medication studies with SCT children other than the few that have tried stimulants. But we can reason our way to conjecture that some other medications might be worth a try. And again, I want to emphasize the conjectural nature of this. But if I had to suggest a hypothesis, I might take a look at atomoxetine, which is Strattera. Now, although it hasn't been studied directly with SCT, we do know from research that atomoxetine does improve anxiety symptoms in both children and adults with ADHD. And since SCT cases are more likely to have anxiety, perhaps atomoxetine might not only treat their anxiety, but it may improve their inattentiveness as well. That remains to be seen, but it's worth, I think, a study. Another possible medication might be modafinil or Provigil. This is an anti-narcoleptic medication that appears to boost arousal and has been shown to improve ADHD symptoms. Given the relatively drowsy, under-aroused, underactivated appearance of SCT symptoms, perhaps an anti-narcoleptic medication might be indicated for them. Again, purely conjectural, but worth some research to find out. Finally, it's possible that if SCT is associated with rumination, and particularly that related to OCD, then one might consider an OCD medication to treat that kind of SCT or preoccupation with one's ruminative thoughts. Two drugs that suggest themselves here are clomipramine and the newer selective serotonergic reuptake inhibitor fluvoxamine, which is Luvox. Might be useful in these instances. But again, let me reiterate, there are no studies I know of atomoxetine, modafinil, or these OCD medications with SCT, but they might be worth a look. Now, to conclude this presentation, let me remind you then that we've tried to distinguish between ADHD and a second attention disorder, which we are calling SCT, for sluggish cognitive tempo. What we have found is that ADHD is a relatively chronic disorder, that it is comprised of at least two dimensions of deficits, those of inhibition and those of inattention. The inattention dimension of symptoms appears to reflect a problem with persistence and resistance to distraction, but also problems with working memory and possibly with other executive functions. And since the executive functions are the basis of self-regulation, it appears that ADHD is also a disorder of self-regulation as well. SCT, in contrast, appears to be a problem with daydreaming, spaciness, confusion, mental fogginess, sluggishness, and underarousal. This is a quite different pattern of difficulties and symptoms, and research so far suggests that SCT is a distinct disorder from ADHD and not a subtype of it. However, both disorders may coexist, and indeed do so in up to 50% of all cases of each disorder. We are likely to see the other disorder. Research on impairment suggests that both disorders are impairing and may be equally as impairing by adulthood. In childhood, SCT may be impairing in the educational domain, but is much less impairing elsewhere. But by adulthood, SCT does appear to interfere as much as ADHD with occupational functioning and with other domains. In general, where both disorders occur together, the comorbid condition is much more impairing than either ADHD or SCT seen alone. Also, we can show that ADHD can be distinguished from other disorders by its childhood onset, its relatively chronic course, its pervasive impact across virtually all domains of executive functioning as seen on rating scales of EF in daily life, and that ADHD is a relatively unremitting disorder and pervasively impairing in nature over time. So I hope that you've learned a great deal from this course. I hope that you will choose to take other courses of mine on this website, and I hope that you'll have a chance to visit my publisher's website, guilford.com, to explore many of the new titles of books that I have on the market, as well as my new rating scales of adult ADHD, of adult executive functioning, and of adult impairment in psychosocial domains. Thank you very much for taking this course. Have a good day.